Hi, Diane.
Hi, Daniel. Hi.
Hi. We'll give it a few more minutes. Hopefully, some more people show up. I think the topic of consciousness is something that it may be abstract for some people, and then for other people, if they had been in a coma for a long time, it's not always something they want to talk about. So I don't know what's going to happen today.
Yeah, it's fine. It's
Yeah.
totally fine because I also find it quite difficult for me. I actually did a thesis on consciousness, brain network for consciousness.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's what led us to this because I remember you saying that, and I was like, oh, wow, that it would be perfect for this.
it,
But yeah, it's
yeah,
a very heavy topic. Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, cool. We'll give it another minute or two. Hopefully, we'll get a few more people. Okay, I think we will begin. So thank you all for coming. Our speaker is Dian Lyu. She's a PhD. She's a researcher. She does some really awesome brain research work and looking at the networks underlying very fundamental aspects of the brain. And I asked Diane to present on the networks of consciousness. And so take it away, Diane. And if you have slides to share, please do. And I hope that this is an interesting topic for anyone.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dian, and I'm actually a postdoc student from Stanford. I did my PhD in the UK, and I had a thesis on the brain networks for consciousness. So I was trained as a cognitive neuroscience. But because I always wondered that if we only study the brain from a normal brain function perspective, we can never really understand how it works. It's like a machine, you have to break it to see how it malfunctions, and then you know how it works. That's why I approached to the medical school in PhD as well as in postdoc, and I did my PhD in clinical neurosciences from a cognitive perspective. So my research will be about the brain networks from a cognitive perspective. However, the thesis was done in medical school. So people always approach me for clinical advice, but I have to disappointingly tell them that even though I'm from medical school, I did like fundamental research, I won't be able to provide any clinical advice. Just want to set the expectation straight from the beginning. And also, I have known Daniel from almost 2 years ago. It was actually very touching to myself that some actual patients approached to me saying that my research can actually help because I have always had this nihilistic perspective to my research. It's too theoretical and fundamental. I didn't really know how it's going to translate one day. But so that's why I also actively participating in this workshop, hoping that one day my research can bridge this gap between clinical, like treatment, diagnosis, and the basic neuroscience. Okay, I'm going to share my slides now. I also want to say that I really thank Daniel for giving me this chance to share my research and give me the practice to do the public outreach because I'm transitioning to a faculty position next year. It's definitely some skill I would like to practice more in the future. Please be free to interrupt me whenever I say something that doesn't make sense, because usually my audience is in academia, so I might use language that feels natural to me but doesn't make sense to anyone. So be free to interrupt me. Does anyone can see my slides now?
Yes, we can see now.
Sharing correctly? Okay. Yeah, it's a very big topic, and even for the field of neuroscience, the investigation of this very highly abstract concept of consciousness really just started, and it's also fueled by the booming, advancing techniques of AI. People are wondering whether AI can have consciousness one day. That's why the neuroscience field are also starting to invest more on the investigation of consciousness. So we are still in the early stage, and I'm showing the newest results coming from the literature, including the recent paper published from our lab. I will break the talk into roughly 3 parts. The first, I'm going to introduce what I mean by brain connectivity. It's a very important concept in order to know what we mean by brain networks, because brain connectivity is the foundation that build up to a network. And among the brain networks, I'm going to focus on a very specific and special one called default mode network, because now the literature or the field is thinking that the default mode network is the most prominent network supporting consciousness. And then I'm going to introduce some of the causal evidence from the clinical field. Research cannot put electrodes in the brain just to investigate the human brain. That's why a lot of the evidence, causal evidence, targeting at the mechanism of the brain come from the clinical field. And I'm going to talk about that in our hospital. So first, what is brain connectivity? We can imagine brain connectivity like these highways in the map. There are a lot of different infrastructures, like infrastructures connecting place to place. And brain connectivity are like this infrastructure connecting the information flow between one neural mass to another neural mass in order to integrate information that coming from different places in the brain. And you can see that the highways, the infrastructure build up are these lines, but not every lines are used at the same level. These red lines, meaning these highways are heavily used, much more so than those black lines. And this is also true for the brain. Then that gives us different measures of connectivity. So when we talk about the infrastructure, when there is a highway built up structurally in the brain, then that's structural connectivity. So it's analogous to what we say the white matter bundle. So that's just the buildup of the brain and it's physically there. And when we talk about the usage of this infrastructure, we are talking about the latter two. And they're slightly different because the axons is directional. So when you starting from one place, then there is only one way to go. That is slightly different than highway, meaning that there is probably just some gate control. You can only go one way, but not the other way. So imagine in the brain what's actually happening in the brain, that these different nodes are different neural mass. And when one neural mass is highly activated, the region connected to this neural mass will be activated following to the activation of the previous one. So there is always time lagging and also directional connectivity going on in the brain. And you would imagine that there are so many nodes in the brain and they're active all the time, then it must be chaotic pattern in terms of the brain activity in the brain. But in reality, things will saturate it to a point, like things will stabilize because they fire in certain pattern that ultimately all these nodes show a stable pattern when you calculate the statistical relationship between each other. And I'm going to emphasize more on the latter part because it's related to what we mean by brain networks. So imagine you have different nodes in the brain and you can extract the signals from this area, and you can also extract another signals from another area, and then you can calculate the correlation between these two. By correlation, I just mean a statistical relationship such that when region A is going up, B is going up. When region A is going down, B is going down. So it's up and up, down, down. It's like co-activation. When two regions are co-activating, it means they are friends. They always do something together. Then they form a group of cluster because they're always together. They're probably part of a family. And that's what we mean by network. So as you calculate a long enough time, say half an hour, by measuring the brain connectivity and calculate the correlation between each nodes, and then you get a cluster of regions with a co-activation pattern. And this is what we mean by network. In reality, when we measure the brain signals, we're basically taking pictures, like active pictures of the brain. So in fMRI or in MRI, it is basically breaking the actual brain into voxels. A voxel is like a pixel in the 3 dimension, and you can get a signal from every of these little cubic. And then you can also do what I said before, do the correlation, and you could extract the regions in the same color, meaning they're in the same network. There are many networks. There are 7 major networks as I plotted here, and the default mode network looks like this. It's a pink one. So why do we care about the default mode network? First, let's look at how it's situated inside of your brain. It's mainly in the medial side of the brain, sitting in the middle of it, and is slightly at the back. That's the core node. It also has a frontal node, and also there are 2 other nodes close to your ear. The reason that we care about the default mode network is because the posterior node, meaning the back node here, is where my mouse is hovering over. This region is the most connected hub in the brain. So it's like the most used bus station or train station in the map. Which means most of the information flow happening in the brain will go across this area. And it also has a very nice location. It's situating at the center of the brain and is surrounded by a lot of artery. So it has abundant artery flow that can protect it from strokes. Um, there are also some specific features of the default mode. I'll talk more. So first, we know what is very well studied in the brain, thanks to the animal study, is the primary sensory cortices, including the visual, auditory, sensory, and motor cortices. So if you set the seed of the core node of the default mode, you'll find that its distance to these primary sensory cortices are the equal farthest, which means that this network probably along the evolutionary process that somehow this information just get emerged here from all those primary sensory cortex and they meet together. So this region might be the place where it process the highest abstract information, farthest away from the primary sensory information. And this is true when you do a meta-analysis, which means just gather all of the results from the previous literature and see from all those neuroimaging studies what each region corresponds to in the behavior domain. And you'll see that the default mode network is highly associated with the most abstract behavior domain, including emotion and social cognition. And of course, it's least correlated with the most tangible behavior domain, like eye movement or motor or visual perception.
So just reading this, then the dark colors are less correlated, the lighter colors are more correlated in the little boxes that are on your graph.
So yeah, so this darker is a Z-score. The Z-score, so that's like a correlation with this, each row is correlating to the color down
Right.
there. So you can see when you correlate with the hot zone is the default mode,
Okay.
right? And the correlation with the motor and eye movement, when you look at this column, is really low. It's none, but it's highly correlated with the social cognition here. Does it make sense? So each of these pixel, this grid, is corresponding to the color.
Yes, yes. Thank you
Mm,
for clarifying it. Yes.
mm. Yeah, so you see there is a nice relationship between the behavior and the function and also the anatomy of the brain. And another interesting thing about the default mode is that when you compare the macaque, so non-human primates, with human brain, you see what are most similar between these two species are the primary sensory cortex, but what is the least similar is the default mode, which is the blue areas here. So imagine if the default mode network is related to highly abstract human-like consciousness or thinking or internal experience, it makes sense that we would assume that non-human primates would have less dysfunction than us, the more we share the tangible sensory domain rather than the intangible abstract domain. And there are also studies directly correlates the consciousness level from the clinical cohort with the connectivity of the default mode network. So the A plot is the positive connectivity and the B plot is negative connectivity. You don't have to know too much about what it means, but it's basically a metric of this network. And you could see that this metric can predict where each group of these patients located in terms of their consciousness level. So there is a linear correlation between along the consciousness level indicated by different levels of consciousness disease, such as from unrespective wakefulness syndrome to minimally consciousness or emergence from minimally conscious all the way to healthy control. So both of these connected metrics can predict that. So then we would wonder what is the function, cognitive function of the default mode network since it's so important. There actually have been a lot of controversies in the literature because consciousness or like highly abstract human cognition is hard to define. Usually when we study a brain area and its function, we would experimental condition and control condition. So experimental condition consists of a group of people who do certain tasks, and the control condition consists of a group of people who don't do that task, and then we contrast their brain activation. But imagine the default mode network. When we call it default mode, means that it's constantly working. So it's constantly helping us to maintain certain like baseline level of brain function. Then you cannot really do this type of study because you would subtract of what is exactly the function. So for a long time, people assume that since default mode, when you subtract from other condition, it deactivates. That means that it's actually more activated during the resting state when when the person is not doing anything in particular. Then the default mode may just represent some baseline activation for healthy function. It doesn't really do much. It's just some unconscious basic thing. Other people will say, okay, it may be related to the mind wandering because when you are doing nothing at all, you are actually doing a lot of, mind wandering or daydreaming thing. And then people also assume that the daydreaming is related to autobiographical memory because when you do a biographical memory task, you do see a lot of activation in the default mode. And other people did a prospective memory. When they call memory, is actually thinking about future events. And it's interesting that when you think about the future events, the brain activation is similar to when you think about the past events. So they are really similar. And also there are other studies about social cognition, that is to interpret what other people think, then you would also see the activation of the default mode. So these are different opinions in the literature. And a recent review article listed here summarized these different views and come up with a new idea to integrate them. And they make a name called the Making Sense Network. I'll explain a little bit more on this. But what Making Sense Network differs from the previous opinion of the functions of the default mode is that previously people assume that the default mode represents some mental activity that requires certain disengagement from the external stimuli, because all of this happens when you are not processing the external information. The recent review article say that's probably not true, because when you are processing external stimuli, you also evoke certain level of internal representation in order to make sense of anything that comes into your mind. I'll explain a little bit more on this point. So they propose that when the events start, um, there will be a lot of events happening as a sequence, and each with its own probability distribution to others, meaning that they are correlated in some sense, and they're all kind of building up over time. It could be minutes and even over days. And in order to make sense of what's going on in happening around this sequence of events, this network default mode will integrate the long-term memory LTM from the prior knowledge with the new information that is happening, registered in the sensory input, and trying to make sense the things that are integrated over time. So it is really important for the default mode to have long enough information registration in order to make sense of what's going on. So when you do a experiment in order to see an effect of the default mode that is correlated between subjects or correlated within the subjects, you will see that whenever the stimulate represent immediately, usually you get a sensory information, sensory cortex activation, but only when the events gradually evolving into a coherent story, and then the default mode network begin to emerge as something that is most active in the brain. And also what's going on when we having in a social context, when we do a conversation, it is an old self, meaning the self that contains all of the past information, past memory of you. Engaging in this conversation will take new information inside of you, and that will update this old self into a new self, because the self is constantly changing based on the changing environment. And then this default mode network will register what's the key point of the conversation, the high level story of the whole scenario. And this is a shared knowledge between this speaker and the listener. And then the listener can interpret what is the abstract key knowledge from this conversation and update the listener's old self. So even though your life experience and my life experience are totally different, so when you talk about one thing, I don't necessarily have the same memory registration of that specific thing, but at a very high level concept level, I get what you mean, because the default mode registers something happening for a very long time, and it abstracts something that very conceptual, high level, that it can be shared across different individuals. Okay, so is there any question up to here before I change to next section? I know it's a little bit abstract. I'm not sure I explained it clearly.
Maz, can I read the question that you wrote, the first question?
Yes.
Um, the social and emotional being most abstract. I know for me, that was there was alteration of those post TBI. I internally observed processing these relationships is problematic and not being able to hold memory enough. So do you have
Mhm.
an understanding about this? Yeah.
And then the next, I wrote that just before you had that slide about how memory is involved. Um,
Mhm.
so you may have answered it in that.
I have I answered enough?
Um, Yeah, I can let that go. And then the next one is just a comment on something I found in myself, and you can say that till later, Dan.
Okay, okay.
Okay. I can share that for me, I certainly had, it was like a break between my internal world and anything from the external world that I tried to put into my internal world. And that was one of the stranger aspects of my, I called it a cognitive problem, but it really was internal world and external world. And I have one discussion that I recorded with Patrick. It's episode 4 in the podcast, or I don't know, it doesn't matter. But he also had that, and it's just there was a clear divide between the internal and the external worlds connecting, and it required really years of work. But it was so weird. So this kind of gives me some context to think about that. So
Mhm.
any other questions?
Okay, so I can then go to the nether section of the last section of the causal evidence from our lab. The reason that I brought up causal evidence is because in order for theory to be actually used in any practical sense, especially in this context, a clinical setting, we have to establish the causal evidence. So all the previous literature that I showed you is correlative, meaning that you ask a healthy patient to do some mental activity and then you see what has changed in their brain signals. Um, but it could be it's correlation. So you cannot say which is influencing what. It could be that the person was able to do that in the first place, and then all the changes you see in the brain are the are following to that. But what if we take that brain away? So meaning lesioning that brain, would that change that function? And we need to know that in order to make it impactful in the clinical world, so we know how to fix the system. Um, as I said before, because default mode, especially the posterior node, is well protected by a lot of major arteries in the brain. So usually you don't get a stroke happening there. So that's why it's so valuable in our lab that we could map the whole brain based on the intracranial electrical stimulation data from the epileptic patients. So the epileptic patients came to the hospital and they would like to know where the source of the epileptic tissue actually located and whether it is safe to take that piece of tissue away. So then the clinical team would implant those electrodes into their brain to have a better estimation where that seizure comes from. And we would also do this like using mild electrical charge to stimulate these brain areas to see whether this area is involved in any important cognitive function. And if it does, maybe lesioning the brain wouldn't be a wise clinical treatment for them. That's why, as a byproduct, we get nice research data to understand how stimulating certain areas would cause some changes in the subjective feeling. So that's the background. And now I'm going to show you the results. All of these electrodes are gathered from a group of patients. So each patient doesn't have so many electrodes. When group everyone together, then you can roughly cover the whole brain. And different colors underneath these electrodes are the networks that I showed you before. So we are looking at the yellow one, which is the default mode. And interestingly enough, when you stimulate the default mode, most likely you don't get any response. So in our case, so after I think this data set has almost more than 20 subjects, and none of them actually reported any subjective changes following the stimulation of the default mode. And this makes us wonder, all of the correlative research that we have done before, are they wrong? If they're correct, why we see nothing changes following the stimulation? So this is still a puzzle in the field to explain why we know that this region is important, why stimulation does cause any effect. But one plausible explanation was that because this region is registering information for long time scale, so it has enough ability to correct itself when there is a glitch in the transient signal processing. So perhaps if we stimulate the regions in this area for minutes and even days, I don't know why we are doing that, but if that happens, then probably you would get some subjective changes. This is one hypothesis and unsolved puzzle in the field. Because we get negative results by electrical stimulation in the default mode, that's why this research this confidential is actually wrong because it's published, it's not confidential anymore. That's why in 2019, when a patient with epileptic tissue in the area close to the default mode came to us, we were able to publish just one single case of this patient because it's so rare. This is the first one, to our knowledge, who had seizure zone in this area, and he himself can provide valuable causal evidence of what is going on in this brain area. So he has this tissue zone in the keynote of the default mode, and he reported that before the epilepsy, he would feel himself listening to two parts of the brain speaking to each other. And he would feel something as if his self is lost. I probably will give you some time to read, and then I'll summarize. So in summary, he felt that before the precuneal epilepsy, the precuneal is the posterior, is the back node of the default mode. He would feel he stopped considering the voices in his head, me. And he felt he doesn't have control over his body anymore. So he used the analogy of controlling a plane as a pilot. When that happens, it feels like he got pulled out of the cockpit. So that's a very interesting phenomenon. But because he has epilepsy since a child, we wonder whether this phenomenon is specific to himself, because over the years and the brain rewiring, perhaps his brain is very different from a normal brain. And ultimately, we would like to come up with a theory that can be generalized across subjects. So following this case study, we recruited 8 more subjects, patients, epileptic patients, this time who didn't have epileptic zone in this specific area. So they have other areas that are problematic. We just want to make sure the regions we care about is not pathological from the start. And because when we do the electro implantation, we can go through different routes as long as we reach the epileptic zone. So there is some level of freedom where we can control where to stick the electrodes in the brain. And luckily, we managed to have coverage of these regions of interest. It's called APCU here, marked in red. So in these patients, when we applied electrical stimulation to this specific area, all of them reported something very similar to the first patient who had a pathological tissue here. And they, of course, said different things, but the gist is that they feel their body is being lifted, like they feel there's a mismatch between the internalized body position and the actual body position. So then we did a network mapping study. These are some technical details you don't have to worry about. The only thing I want to point out is the causal connectivity mapping. So before we talked about the correlation, and here we are talking about causal connectivity. This is even a more intuitive method, which is basically inject a very mild electric charge into one side of the electrode, and in the meantime, listening to all other electrodes to see what's going on happening to this stimulation, so that we can map the information flow of the structural connectivity. So, and this is a video showing the effect when you stimulate the hot zone and the cold zone. So the cold zone is basically the default mode, and the hot zone is the new area we found called APCU. Once you stimulate these two zones, see what's going on in the rest of the brain areas. And the third row is the contrast between the two. So you can see they are actually mapping to different networks. So now stimulation happening, the hot area is where the signal propagates to. Now it's quiets down within 500 milliseconds. So you see they map to different areas, especially like around maybe 60 milliseconds. You see the hot zone during the look at the contract, you see they map to these areas, while the cold zone maps to more the medial side of the brain. But the hot zone also connects a lot with the cold zone. So they actually talk to each other because this area is all hot. Now we are very puzzled by this because previously we know the default mode is about self, but self is cold. However, adjacent region to the default mode is hot and is related to self-displacement. And we went back into the literature and we realized that there is actually another line of self-study that is very different from the self-study that I showed you before. So these are independent lines. I don't have time to talk more about these lines of study, but briefly speaking, we found that the default mode is about a narrative self. It is when you travel into your memory to figure out who you are. When you ask the question who you are, then the default mode is the most active. So you can think of it as me. Like when you think, who am I? It's talking to people, this is me. So that's a me network. While the bodily self is something totally different. It's related to multisensory integration. Because in the previous literature, when you look at the brain areas related to the multisensory bodily processing, it's almost overlap with the areas responding to body ownership or self-identification and self-location. To give you a sense of what multisensory integration is, here is a very classic study. So it's called the rubber hand experiment. It is when, so the experiment is when is to give a rubber hand to trick participants to think it is part of their hand. Of course, you think it's obviously very simple to distinguish a rubber hand from your own hand, but your brain really cannot be so cleanly separate them, even though you know they are not. And the way they do it is to brush the real hand and the rubber hand at the same time while you are looking at the rubber hand. By this very simple manipulation, you would trick your brain to take into account this rubber hand as part of you. So this is a rough introduction. I'm going to show the video and shut up. So you see, this is not something that you can stop. And it also gives us another other implication, which is that um, the self is a statistical buildup. So your brain is constantly integrating information from all aspects and gradually construct something that you would call self. So it has to be integrated over time. If there is something traumatic happening in your life, either it's psychological or something physical like traumatic brain injury that happens, then there will cause some mismatch between an old self and a new self, and you would feel weird. And maybe gradually over time, when you integrate enough information, a new construct of self with coherent information happening inside will build up. But uh, but for a short time, it would just break the statistical logics inside of this buildup. So I guess that's the implication I get from the body ownership experiment. Um, so
Can I ask a
uh,
question about the brain
mhm.
regions that you had in the previous slide? Are those parietal brain regions? Yeah,
Which slides are you talking
the
about?
one, this one.
Yes. Yes, these are superior parietal lobule, and this is inferior parietal lobules. Altogether, they are parietal lobes.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I had mainly parietal injury, but I've had a lot of discussions with people describing those two, either a bodily shift or a loss of, and I had the loss of inner self. Like I called it my mind is not my mind, but it was like narrative self, inner voice or inner me gone. And I've had multiple recordings with people describing a bodily shift, and it quite seems quite distinct.
Yeah, so this part is really important because not only it registers the bodily self network, but also the inferior parietal lobule is part of the default mode network. So the default mode network is what you mean when you say the internal self. When you internalize who you are, that's mainly will evoke the activation of the default mode. This is all from my um, basic science research. I don't know like exactly how it can translate to the clinical world, because in real situation things are way more complicated than this. You would also have white matter damage, perhaps. So the white matter is the basic infrastructure that make what we see as it is right now. So it's more complicated than what I'm showing here.
But one thing, and if you look
Mm.
at the chat, there's a few comments that
I
the
I can't I can't
oh
really read. Can
yeah,
you
no worries, I
help?
can read it, but people have experiences of injury to these aspects. In these cases, it's much more of a break of that system within us. And I've certainly experienced that and met multiple people also, this explains so much. I can read some of the other comments, but yeah, these are the things
Mm,
that can get injured in a person, and then to have a context, to have a brain system. This is physical brain. This is physical processes that get injured, who knows exactly what happens when a brain injury happens, but it doesn't function. And it's in general, it's kind of like you don't have evidence to explain it, but at least this provides a context to explain what has gotten injured in us. I mean,
mm,
all this for me
mm,
is about what the brain is to figure out what happened in my brain injury. So yeah.
mhm, mhm. I hope it explains something. Because when I listened to the podcasts that he recommended, I felt it makes sense based on what I know. But of course, I don't have a like first person perspective of what actually is going on in other people's minds. But based on what people report, it kind of makes sense because there is a discontinuity of the buildup, like the whole systematic coherence before, since the trauma, then something's missing. Then, as a system, as the self is a system level representation, then it's like a hole there. And
Yeah, and that's ridiculous to say that, except it isn't because given the neuroscience and or rather, if you say that to somebody that the self is a collection of information that your brain processes, people without brain injury or without this kind of research will say, "What are you talking about? You're reducing it down to something." But the brain is a organ that processes and has coherences and all this complex function happening. And yeah, it gets just injured in us. I can also share, I have one recording that the person told me not to put out, but she gets into that whole airplane analogy. So I hadn't seen it
mm,
before from anyone else except for her. Yeah, there's the mind, or how do you know what the person's saying, or you can never feel it. But in the case of brain injury, oftentimes we're denied. People say that's not real, that doesn't exist, that's in your head. Meanwhile, the brain is what got injured. It's one step towards helping in the right ways. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know if it's helpful, but I feel this multisensory integration. I know it's a bit hard for me to understand to explain, but I do get a inspiration from this, which is that brain or your something happening in your mind, such as the mentalization of self, is dynamic. So you do integrate new information day by day and to make sense of what's going on inside of you. And that is self. It's not something there when you break it, it will never come back because it's never the same. Every day you integrate new information and it will gradually changing you in certain way and making you a different person. But because the daily activity is mild, so you don't feel the change. But traumatic memories or injury cause a drastic change. So you immediately feel there's a discontinuity in it. But over time, maybe when you gathered so much information that will overrun those missing information by this trauma experience, by comparison, you feel there's a continuity happening again. I hope that is something that may be used towards a treatment, um, just to focus on building up the continuity in the daily life. And I don't know, conceptually, I feel this may bring some hope. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I'm in one of these groups online that's a depersonalization, derealization. And the sad thing is that when they have the devastation of the loss of self being so drastic, then they are also depressed and in bed and not leaving the house. And there's a lot of problems that come on top or trauma that adds on top. Meanwhile, the explanation you're giving and giving them, if the people had the right sort of feedback and support and got used to the new self, then that would be a lot better. But it's there's like a black hole of not being understood or not being supported in on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm.
Maz, you have a question?
Can I stop sharing so I can talk to you face to face?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. So I wrote a couple things in the chat. I guess you can't see it, but I hear what you're saying about maybe, there's ways of uh, gathering enough information and integration. But I found I've had 40 years of brain injury, traumatic brain injury, car accident. And I found that nothing, like it can't really get to the using any other routes or any other kind of connectivity than what exists post TBI. And the only thing that has helped has been nutritional and some medical drugs intervention that affect the dopamine receptors. I have this experience, and it's related to fatigue that um, that the amantadine and Ritalin help with reducing. But before I started taking those, when I was getting fatigue, I would look at my hand and arm and it would look like it was not connected to my body. Like I had the perception it wasn't, even though, I'm fully, aware that yes, that's my hand and arm. But the perception was that it was not mine connected to it. And I found that I was kind of funny and interesting, but it was just before I would then start to lose my ability to walk and talk. So the fatigue would progress, and it seems to be related to dopamine receptors because these medications and a specific nutrient, octacosanol, which also affects dopamine receptors, has helped in various ways. Of the octacosanol seems to capture the environmental stimuli, at least visually, I notice, so that I have more information and helps the memory a little bit when I'm reading. So I think there's, something beyond this that needs to be considered, that's biochemical and not just the electrical systems, but maybe, what feeds the electrical systems, the nutrients and the what's getting in there to run it, that's affected with TBI. Anyway, that's been my experience. I went back and got a master's in nutritional sciences to try to understand, and I hope someday to go back and get my PhD, to further this understanding of what's gone wrong with me, and interventions that have brought me further. I started taking the medications 28 years after my brain injury. And so to have such a significant change and improvement, and struggling, I mean, I pushed myself very, very hard. So there was no lack of trying, and observation and working on myself. So to me, that mattered a lot. And I hope someday to have that integrated with other research.
Thanks for sharing. That's really inspiring.
Thank you for your work.
One thought about the dopaminergic activation and what was presented here is that I imagine, so this is postulation, but the basal ganglia has a lot of dopaminergic activity, and that is the chemical signaling underlying the processing. And that region is very bodily and also the kind of creates an automaticity, or at least the research, not with brain injury, shows that it creates the automaticity of what is normally, when you're doing something like at a click or just something that was once complicated becomes then easy to use in second nature. So I wonder if that signal feeding into this self network stuff is what that pharmacology helps in you, Moz. But it's hard to know. And each brain is so different. Plus, then the brain injury is so different. But it's
Well, I also
yeah,
experienced other things with the medication. I
yes.
had difficulty with auditory processing, and the Ritalin was given to me for fatigue, but I got almost all my language skill so improved. Aphasia, um, auditory processing, reading, everything related to language was improved with Ritalin. I did have a big cut in the parietal temporal region, so I relate to what you're talking about there. I never felt like I was a different person though. I just couldn't communicate or, ex- you know, be that person because I lost so many of the language skills and that sort of thing. Other
Yeah.
than the arm not being appearing like it's my own, but that only became with fatigue.
One thing about the self and versions of loss of self, I've seen. I can't remember some big magazine that's for brain injury was the person on the cover was saying, I haven't lost myself, I'm the same person, but every person's symptoms are different. And what you just described with the language, someone may or may not have that. I didn't have it with language, I had it with thought. Thought was gone. That was well, it's hard to rank all the problems, but
Hi,
yeah.
my name is Lisa. I'm wondering anybody's experience with PNES,
What's
uh,
that?
uh, psychogenic seizures as a result of brain injury.
I didn't have that. I don't know that one. Yeah.
It caught my attention when somebody was saying how they didn't recognize their hand and their arm as being attached to themselves.
Oh, that was me, but no, I don't have seizures. Um, I do shake and have difficulty walking. It looks like a seizure, but it's not. I now understand it to be dopamine not recycling. There's a research that noted that, and that's what got me on the mantidine, and that's helped stop the problems with the um, difficulty with walking and talking. And just wish there was more coordination with that kind of information, with your kind of research as well, Diane. really appreciate what you're doing and how hard you're working.
Diane, do you have any background with PNES?
Oh, although I'm in the epilepsy lab, but I don't do clinical work, but it's not uncommon to develop epilepsy after brain trauma, but I'm not expert on this at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know that different types of seizures come out and often after brain injury, and I got to go back and record with this guy, actually record the discussion, but I had a fascinating discussion with the guy. He's in his 50s, and since he was 15, he'd had seizures, and they did a number of surgeries to try to relieve the site of where the epilepsy was. And he said that he got used to he basically would take a massive amount of psychedelics the week before because he knew after the surgery, reality and so many problems in him would be so different. And he got used to that. Like he got used to shifting his brain with the drugs to then be ready for what the seizure surgery would do to him. And it's like, wow, like that, it's pretty wild. I hope to record with him one day, but he had to do that through his teenage years, because so many things changed in him so drastically. And I mean, that's all I know about it. Rachel?
I have a question just kind of for everybody. And I'm curious because talking about seizures and everyone's different, but is there a typically like a certain amount of time before someone would start getting seizures after they've had a brain injury if they've never had seizures before?
I cannot say for sure, but I do know people can develop seizure after brain trauma, but without having seizure before. I know it exists, but I don't know the statistics.
I think one aspect that can contribute to if it develops, based on a discussion I've had with another few people, is kind of like deterioration of their life quality and taking care of themselves, and then the stress and combination of factors leading the brain to eventually get into that state, which is pretty sad because it's not directly because of the brain injury. And I know a lot of the medial temporal lobe brain injuries, they lead to seizures very quickly because that region, I guess, is highly conducive to seizing. So, but that's all I'm familiar with.
We actually don't really know the cause of seizure. So there's a lot of research happening about it, but we really don't have a very conclusive idea of what caused it. It can be a lot of causes. So it could be psychogenic or traumatic or genetic. Yeah, some child develops seizures and then it will disappear with age.
Wow.
So yeah, we don't really know. I'm sorry. I should have known more because I'm in the epilepsy lab, but
Well, I think it's good to say that we don't know because we don't know. And with brain injury, it's like the best doctors I had were like, well, we don't know. And it's like, okay, that's better than them denying what you're saying. So it's good that we don't know. It's good to be honest about it. Oh, okay.
Well, when I started getting mine later in life, I never had any um until my early 30s or something. And the fourth one was the one that caused my accident that gave me a brain injury. But I went 30 plus years with no seizure.
Wow. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Holly?
My question was like the dopamine. I just was, maybe it's towards Maz or whoever might know, but I always thought dopamine was more like a pleasure center kind of thing, but is it also a energy or like an adrenaline or energy or like motivation thing? Because when I neurofatigue, the first thing that goes for me is my speaking ability and my walking and balance ability. So is dopamine part of that equation? Because this is the first I've heard of that aspect of it.
Well, I've been given the diagnosis of pseudo Parkinson syndrome, because the fatigue, it's almost like Parkinson's. Where Parkinson's, they don't make enough dopamine because their cells are dying. But for me, I make enough dopamine if I sleep well enough. It's just that because it's not recycling through the day, it starts to have less available for the brain to use. And so that affects similar systems that Parkinson's experience over a long period of time, Whereas for me, it's through that day. So it's like I get Parkinson's by the end of the day. And that's what I've experienced.
Yeah, thank you both. I know that we're all observing ourselves and trying to figure out what is happening. Dennis, did I interrupt you? Did you have something to say?
Oh, well, no, you didn't interrupt me. I did have one other thing just for Deanne. It was a nice presentation. It helped me understand. I really lost like 5 years of memory. I didn't recognize the house we currently live in, which I helped buy and move into 3 years before the accident. And it was just gone. It was a new house again. And so I had a lot of things like that. But it was odd to me too. I was largely unconscious for 7 weeks, and I woke up in a skilled nursing facility, but I knew who I was, and I knew that it was me. And it was just an odd thing. It was like, well, I know who I am, but why am I here? And then it was only after that I realized the big memory holes, you know. So the model, I forget the name of it now, that default system, must have that going. So
Yeah, I think the nature of what got injured, damaged, made harder to use or just gone in us. Although it's different for each person, I had that for my internal self, but memory wasn't good, but it definitely wasn't the chief lost system in me. And I think yeah, I mean there's so much to talk about. And Holly, I could say that as a neuroscientist, I was trying to make sense of the brain, trying to learn about it. And I could say that every brain region has cells with receptors for just start listing all the neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, everything, the glutamate, the GABA there. Dopamine is involved in every part of the brain to some extent more than others. It's talked about in the reward circuit and it's talked about in the basal ganglia, but I'm sure it affects the networks that um, Dan presented today, the default mode and all the rest. So it's, yeah, so, okay, cool. Well, all right.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, I said cool. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Diane. This was really great, and I think we're gonna call it a day because, well, it's time to go. So,
Hope to
can you?
continue here about
Thank
your
you
work,
so much.
Diane.
thank
Yeah,
Oh,
nice
you.
meeting
man.
everyone. I
Thank
just want
you.
to have a little bit disclaimer since you're going to post it online. Everything I
Yeah.
said is my personal opinion. It doesn't represent my institute. So if anything is incorrect, it's my fault. So
I'll make sure to keep that in the recording. And well, thank you for sharing your opinion because I had I have two discussions and recordings with researchers that they said don't put it out or only put it out once it gets published. And meanwhile, it's a really good discussion about well, it doesn't matter what it's about, but it's people are afraid to share their opinion. So thanks.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
in academic standard, it's a bit far-reaching, but I think it might be interesting just to share how I think of it.
Well,
It was.
Thank you,
yeah,
Diane.
Yeah.
yeah. The
Yeah.
stuff we're talking about, if there's no research for it, it still needs to be discussed, and the experiences people are having needs to be. Um, I've said before, in the worst case, they deny it or they say, "Oh, this is just something else," but it's not. It's injury to those parts of the brain has a very real feeling. I know everyone here can attest to that.
Mm.
All right.
The clinical medicine, like also research, are still very early in discovering the brain functions. So I believe that you probably knows more than some of the doctors because you have all the firsthand information of what's going on inside of you. So I really appreciate all of you participating in it, making it happen, and it's also a learning resource for me.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you. And Diane, your opinion is very valuable. I understand what you have to go through to get published. But it's just know that it's valuable, your insight.
Thank
And
you.
Yes, and I'm always saying they're starting to learn things at the scientific level about brain injury, but it's not down to the clinical level. So I appreciate you guys for doing the research and pushing those boundaries and educating the world as you discover things. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
Thank you for the encouragement.
there's a
Yeah.
huge gap. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
Lisa, I
Bye,
got you.
everybody.